Moment Howard Brennan said, "This entire project would take half the time if my son managed it." The conference room went dead silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I sat at the far end of that polished table, the only guy on the engineering side of the board meeting, and every head in the room turned toward me like I was some kind of museum exhibit. They pretended it was just a casual comment. It wasn't. It was a shot fired with surgical precision. I'm Bradley Morrison, 54 years old, and I've been busting my ass in engineering for over 25 years. Started right after my Navy discharge, worked my way up from field technician to senior engineering manager at Atlas Engineering Solutions here in Houston. I thought I'd seen every kind of corporate politics there was, but Howard was playing a different game entirely. Stephen Cross, our founder and CEO, leaned back in his chair without even blinking. The board members were all watching him like they were waiting for a verdict, but he just sat there, silent. Not yet, anyway. Howard folded his hands and locked eyes with me. "Jason understands the pace our clients demand," he continued. "Bradley's approach is methodical." The way he said that last word made it sound like a disease. Jason Brennan sat 2 seats away from me, looking like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. Fresh MIT degree, expensive suit, and that smug smile that only comes from never having to earn anything the hard way. When our eyes met, he raised an eyebrow like he was already measuring my office for new furniture. I felt that resignation letter in my briefcase before I even touched it. I'd printed it the night before, not because I wanted to quit, but because I could see where this was heading. Howard had been setting this up for weeks, maybe months. The condescending tone in his voice just confirmed what I already knew. I stood up slowly. "If you want your son to handle it," I said, keeping my voice level, "then this belongs to you." I placed the folded letter on the table. Jason's smile got wider, sharp and victorious. Stephen finally spoke. "Fine," he said, his voice giving nothing away. "Give the project to his son." Howard exhaled like he'd just won the lottery. Jason straightened up in his chair, probably already planning his victory speech. Then Stephen turned his gaze toward me. "Bradley," he said, "meet me in 10 minutes. Bring that resignation letter with you." His tone didn't show anger or sympathy. It showed nothing at all. And somehow, that was worse than either. I walked out of that boardroom with the letter in my hand and this weird feeling that whatever was waiting behind Stephen's closed door was going to change everything. When I first moved to Houston after my divorce 3 years ago, I never thought I'd end up in boardrooms where somebody else's family connections decided whether my work mattered. I came here with a truck full of tools, my Navy training, and the simple belief that if you did good work, people would notice. Atlas Engineering was supposed to be different. During my early years here, Howard barely acknowledged me. If we passed in the hallway, he'd give me a quick nod and keep walking. Back then, his indifference was easier to deal with than what came later. "Bradley, you always know which fire to put out first," my old supervisor Carol used to tell me, and I knew she meant it. During the 2020 oil crash, when half our contracts went sideways overnight, I spent 12-hour days rebuilding safety protocols that kept 3 major projects from getting shut down completely. Carol called me her rock. Howard called it luck. That should have been my first warning that we weren't living in the same reality. Jason showed up at the company about 18 months ago. Howard introduced him at a staff meeting with his hand on the kid's shoulder like he was presenting the crown prince. "Fresh perspective," he said, looking straight at me like youth alone could replace 2.5 decades of field experience. Jason shook my hand with that practiced smile. "I've heard your engineering work is solid," he said, and the pause before that last word told me everything I needed to know. The changes started small. A meeting that should have included engineering input suddenly didn't need my department. A safety report I wrote came back with whole sections rewritten to remove my name. Data I'd verified got altered before it reached the board, smoothing over Jason's mistakes and erasing my corrections. When I mentioned it to my team, Scott Hamilton lowered his voice. "We see it, Bradley. We just can't say anything. You know how Howard operates." I knew, and I could feel the ground shifting under my feet long before Howard tried to push me out completely. The thing I didn't know then was how far he was willing to go to make his son look like a genius. Jason Brennan walked into Atlas Engineering like the building had been designed specifically for him. He had that polished confidence of someone who'd never heard the word no. an MIT degree he waved around like a magic wand, and a last name that opened doors faster than any resume ever could. "Looking forward to learning from you," he told me during his first week. The way he said it made it clear the learning was going to be optional. The shift started quietly. A technical report I'd finalized came back with Jason's notes scribbled in the margins. "Just updating the language," he said, even though his revisions introduced errors I had to fix later. In a team meeting, I presented the new safety protocols. Jason jumped in before I finished. "Actually, I walked the team through this on Monday," he announced. The room looked back and forth between us. Scott started to correct him, but I shook my head. It wasn't worth embarrassing him in front of everyone. Not yet. A few days later, one of my technicians, Michelle, caught me by the coffee machine. "Jason pulled us aside," she whispered. "He said the company needs more innovative thinking. He said you were competent but old school." I felt that sting in my throat, but I kept my voice calm. "Thanks for telling me." The more Jason pushed, the more Howard praised him. "He sees the future," Howard said in a meeting, patting Jason's shoulder. "We can't cling to outdated methods." Board members started repeating the exact same phrases Howard used. Innovation, fresh leadership, cutting dead weight. Their eyes drifted toward me every time. I started documenting everything. Emails, timestamps, discrepancies, conversations. I didn't know what I'd eventually need it for, but I could feel the ground shifting faster than I could hold it steady. Howard wasn't treating me like a valued employee anymore. He was treating me like an obstacle, and I needed to understand why he felt threatened enough to rewrite reality. Howard's first performance review landed in my inbox on a Thursday morning. The subject line looked routine, but the content was anything but. My name appeared exactly once, buried in a bullet point at the bottom. Engineering support provided as needed. I stared at it for a long moment before forwarding it to my team. Scott responded almost immediately. "Where are the safety improvements and the contract salvage work?" I typed back. "Ask Howard." I knew he wouldn't. At the next leadership meeting, Howard projected his updated report on the screen. "As you can see," he said, tapping the slide, "process inefficiencies stem from outdated approaches. Bradley's methods worked years ago, but current demands require different thinking." I kept my eyes on the table. Outdated approaches was code for anything I'd built. Jason leaned forward with fake modesty. "I've been testing a streamlined process. With enough support, we can cut weeks off delivery." One of the board members, Helen Ross, nodded. "Speed is what matters now." I spoke quietly but firmly. Speed without proper safety protocols puts us at risk. Several steps Jason removed are required by federal regulation. Howard's smile tightened. "Regulations can be updated." "They can," I said, "but not without disclosing operational changes to clients." For a moment, nobody said anything. Then another board member chimed in, echoing Howard's earlier words. "We need innovation, not resistance." There it was. Words don't travel that far unless they've been planted. Through it all, Stephen Cross sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression unreadable. He neither agreed nor disagreed. He just watched. By the end of that meeting, the damage was clear. The board didn't just hear Howard, they believed him. And Stephen's silence meant he saw exactly what was happening, but was choosing not to step in yet. I walked out wondering what that silence was really about, and why he wanted to see how far Howard would push. Stephen's office door was already open when I got there, resignation letter in hand. He didn't tell me to sit down. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Close the door, Bradley." I did. My palms were sweating, the letter warm from gripping it too tight. He nodded toward the paper. "You brought that this morning?" "Yes." "Why?" His voice was even, not accusing, almost curious. I met his eyes. Howard's been clearing the path for Jason for months. Today wasn't spontaneous. And if I stayed quiet any longer, I'd become the excuse they needed to tear apart everything we've built. Stephen studied me closely. "What do you think Jason can't handle?" I didn't sugarcoat it. The technical dependencies, the safety protocols, the regulatory structures I put in place after the 2018 incident. There are systems that only work because they were built with field experience in mind. Remove the wrong piece, and the whole thing comes apart. He exhaled slowly. "I suspected as much." "I suspected what?" My pulse jumped. That Howard's been falsifying progress reports, he said, glossing over Jason's mistakes, presenting selective data. He tapped his desk. The numbers didn't add up, but I needed confirmation. I held my breath. And now you have it? I do. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and slid a business card toward me. Gulf Coast Consulting. They're one of our most critical partners. I frowned. You want me to work for them? I want you somewhere Howard can't manipulate you or the data, he said. If you resign, I'll accept it, but your expertise is too valuable to be buried under his politics. The card felt heavier than it should have. Stephen's move wasn't a dismissal. It was strategy, and I was starting to understand I'd been standing on a chessboard without realizing it. Gulf Coast Consulting welcomed me with polite smiles and a stack of files that could have used its own zip code. My short-term contract was described as a routine operational review, but the way their director, Caroline Wells, looked at me told a different story. We appreciate you stepping in, Caroline said, handing me the first binder. Atlas's reports haven't aligned with our field data for months. Stephen said you're the only person who can explain the gaps. Only person. Those words hit something in my chest. I sat at a desk near Caroline's office and opened the top file. The first page showed a timeline I recognized from my original work at Atlas, but the next few pages were wrong. Steps removed, milestones relabeled, numbers smoothed into suspiciously clean patterns. I flagged one section and called Caroline over. Where did this come from? Howard sent it, she said. He claimed the engineering team approved the modifications. I kept my voice steady. I never approved any of this. She frowned. Then why does his report say you streamlined these processes? Because he needed Jason to look like a miracle worker, I thought, but I didn't say that yet. 2 hours later, Caroline came back with another file. Bradley, look at these safety logs. They don't match your original protocols. She was right. They didn't. The logs marked as Jason's efficiency improvements were identical to preliminary drafts I'd written months earlier. Drafts I'd never released because they weren't ready. I called Scott at Atlas. Did Howard access my archived files? He hesitated. Bradley, he asked for admin overrides, said it was for a compliance audit. I didn't think I could say no. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. Gulf Coast's documents weren't revealing a misunderstanding. They were revealing deliberate manipulation. Howard hadn't just altered reports. He'd stolen my work, rebranded it, and used it to make his son look competent. And whatever he was hiding was serious enough to risk destroying the company he claimed to protect. By day 3 at Gulf Coast, the evidence wasn't whispering anymore. It was shouting. Every document I opened pointed to the same architect, Howard Brennan. I spread 3 reports across the desk. Caroline stood behind me as I traced a line with my finger. This projection, I said, is built on Jason's supposedly improved efficiency. Caroline leaned closer. But this safety log shows the original error rates. My error rates. This was your preliminary work, I corrected her. Jason copied it and changed the timestamps. She sucked in a breath. How many files? Enough to make incompetence look like brilliance. The next file was worse. It contained budget reallocations I'd never authorized. Tens of thousands shifted into Jason's pilot projects. I flipped to the signature page. Here, I said. He claimed the cost savings came from my department. That's impossible. Caroline's voice dropped. Bradley, this is intentional fraud. I nodded. He inflated Jason's performance and buried every mistake under my name. Howard signed off on all of it. Caroline left the room and came back with their compliance officer, Marcus Drake. Our system flagged major inconsistencies, Marcus said. Your findings triggered an automatic audit. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply handed him the folder. These are the discrepancies. Use them however your protocols require. He scanned the pages and whistled low. This isn't sloppy work. This is deliberate falsification. Send it to Stephen Cross, I said, and the board. They need to see it exactly as it is. Marcus nodded. We'll send it today. By late afternoon, Gulf Coast's formal audit report was already on its way to Atlas Engineering, complete with signatures, timestamps, and confirmation that the altered files originated under Howard's authority. The house of cards he'd built, meeting by meeting, lie by lie, was about to collapse under its own weight. The emergency meeting happened less than 24 hours after Gulf Coast sent their audit. I wasn't invited, but Scott called me the moment he stepped out of the boardroom. Bradley, it was brutal, he whispered. I could hear voices behind him, raised and desperate. Then Stephen's voice cut through everything, steady and cold. "Howard, explain the discrepancies." There was shuffling, stammering. Then Howard's weak response. "Those files were taken out of context." Stephen didn't budge. "Gulf Coast traced the alterations to your authorization. Not context. Control." Another voice followed. Helen Ross from the board, driving the point home. "You misled us, Howard. For months." Jason tried to jump in. "Dad didn't mislead anyone. The data was misinterpreted." "Sit down, Jason," Stephen said. "No anger, just command. Your modified protocols failed the minute Bradley left. The audit shows you removed federally required safety steps." Jason's voice cracked. He could have helped if he hadn't quit. Helen cut him off. "He quit because you two pushed him out," Scott whispered. "Bradley, you should have seen their faces." Another board member spoke next. "Jason will be removed from all project authority immediately." Jason sputtered. "You can't do this," Stephen overrode him. "And Howard Brennan is terminated, effective immediately." The room fell silent. I could almost feel it through the phone. Reputations crashing, careers ending, justice finally catching up. Then Helen said something I didn't expect. "We owe Bradley Morrison an apology." Scott exhaled. They all agreed. Even Stephen. I pressed my hand to my chest, keeping my voice steady. "Understood." I ended the call before the emotion could spill over. Justice was finally happening, but I still didn't know what it meant for my future. Stephen chose a small diner near Buffalo Bayou, far from Atlas's corporate towers and polished conference rooms. When I walked in, he was already seated with an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Bradley, sit." I did, keeping myself steady even though my nerves were humming. He folded his hands. "You handled this with remarkable professionalism." I met his eyes. "I handled the truth. That's all." "That," he said quietly, "was exactly what I needed you to do." I frowned. "You needed me to leave Atlas?" "I needed you outside Howard's reach," he replied. "If you'd stayed, he would have buried you under enough false documentation to confuse even the board. Gulf Coast was the only place he couldn't tamper with your findings." I let that sink in. The resignation that had felt like an ending had been part of a larger strategy, one I hadn't known I was part of. Stephen leaned forward. "Integrity has always been your strength. You don't inflate numbers, you don't play politics, you work with facts, and that's rare." I stayed quiet, waiting. He placed a folder on the table. "This is a long-term consulting contract. You'd work for Gulf Coast and report directly to me, not as an employee, but as a partner." The word hit like a steady drumbeat in my chest. "Partner?" Stephen nodded. "You'd lead the safety architecture for the projects we're starting next quarter. No internal politics, no interference, full authority." I breathed slowly, letting the weight of it settle. Not a return to Atlas, not a second chance inside the same broken system. Something completely different. Something where I wouldn't have to shrink to survive. "I'll review the contract tonight," I said. Stephen allowed the faintest smile. "Take your time. This is your future to decide." As I left that diner, I realized the vindication I'd imagined, walking back into Atlas victorious, was too small for the life opening up in front of me. I signed the consulting contract with Gulf Coast on a Tuesday morning. No ceremony, no handshakes beyond Caroline's warm smile. The signature felt less like closure and more like oxygen finally reaching a part of me that had been starved too long. The numbers were real. Base consulting rate of $165 per hour, guaranteed 40 hours per week, plus performance bonuses tied to project milestones. Stephen's partnership deal included equity stakes in the new safety division. After 18 months of watching my work get stolen and my reputation attacked, I was looking at nearly double my old Atlas salary. Later that afternoon, as I reviewed the first phase of Stephen's new initiative, Scott called. His voice was steady in a way I hadn't heard in months. "It's official," he said. "Howard's termination became permanent. Jason's completely out too. They said the falsified reports were enough to void any appeals." I exhaled slowly. "Their choices, not mine." "I know," he replied. "Everyone knows." He paused before adding, "The company's restructuring. Compliance is rewriting half our policies. People keep saying your resignation didn't break Atlas. The lies about you did." He hung up after promising to stay in touch, and I leaned back in my chair, letting his words settle. For the first time in months, I didn't feel vindicated or angry. I felt free. Stephen stopped by Gulf Coast later that week. He didn't knock, just appeared in the doorway with that same unreadable calm. "Settling in?" "I am," I said. "Good," he replied. "There's a larger contract coming after this one. Multi-year safety overhaul for the entire Gulf region. You'll lead it." I nodded. "I'm ready." The board approved the budget yesterday. 8-figure contract. Your piece of it will set you up for the next decade. As he left, I realized how strange it was to be valued without having to defend my place. I didn't need to return to Atlas to prove anything. Not to the board, not to those who doubted me, and not to the ones who tried to replace experience with connections and shortcuts. That evening I drove to my son Ryan's high school to pick him up from football practice. He'd been quiet about the whole Atlas situation, but I could tell he was watching how I handled it. 17 years old, trying to figure out what kind of man he wanted to become. "Dad," he said as he got in the truck, still in his practice gear. "Coach Patterson heard about your new job. He said Gulf Coast Consulting is a big deal." I glanced at him. "It is. And you're like, a partner now?" "Yeah, I am." Ryan was quiet for a moment, then said something that hit me harder than any board meeting ever could. "I told the guys at school my dad doesn't back down when people try to screw him over. But he doesn't get mad about it either. He just handles it." I had to swallow before I could respond. Sometimes the best way to win is to walk away and build something better. "That's pretty cool, Dad." Later that night, after Ryan went to bed, I called my ex-wife Linda. We'd been divorced for 3 years, and things had been tense during the Atlas mess. She'd worried about my ability to provide stable support payments, especially with Ryan heading to college in a year. "Brad," she said when she picked up, "Ryan told me about the partnership. It's a good opportunity," I said. "He also said you handled everything without losing your temper. That matters to him, you know. He's been watching." I leaned against my kitchen counter, looking out at the Houston skyline. I figured as much. "The financial stability helps too," she admitted. "College is expensive, and I was worried." "You don't need to worry anymore," I said. "This contract will cover Ryan's education, and then some." There was a pause. "I'm proud of you, Brad, for not letting them break you." After we hung up, I stepped outside onto my back porch. The night air was humid, typical Houston weather, but it felt different somehow, cleaner. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline at Gulf Coast. "First project review meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Stephen will be there. Big things ahead." I typed back, "Ready for it." And I was. For the first time in years, I was working with people who valued what I brought to the table instead of trying to diminish it. Stephen hadn't just offered me a job. He'd given me a platform to build the kind of career I'd always believed was possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. Howard had pushed me out to make room for his incompetent son, and in doing so, he'd freed me to become something bigger than I ever could have been inside Atlas's political machine. They used to rely on my work and pretend they didn't. Now they'd rely on the systems I create without ever being able to control me again. Howard and Jason had destroyed their own careers trying to destroy mine, and I hadn't had to lift a finger against them. The truth had done all the work. The truth and a little patience. Sometimes the best revenge is just refusing to stay small when other people need you to. In the end, competence doesn't need permission to shine. It just needs the right stage, and sometimes that stage is built by walking away from the wrong audience. The most powerful revenge against those who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's building a life so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant.